Welcome back to Good Revenue. We are here today with Tina Brown. She is the president and COO of Overland-Tandberg, and she has more than 25 years experience in technology manufacturing, as well as expertise in cybersecurity and M&A. Tina, we're very excited to have you here today.
Glad to be here.
Thank
Glad to be
you.
here.
So, we're going to talk about business pivots and M&A today. You are an expert in tech manufacturing. You oversee operations in more than 100 countries. What are some of the trends that you are watching and what's top of mind for you right now?
It's interesting you asked that because we're looking at our planning for 2025 and 2026. And a real trend we see is from a global perspective, our customers are pushing more and more out from a third party perspective, whether it's their data, whether it's their services, whether it's their infrastructure. They're pushing a lot more of that out to save costs, to leverage maybe economies of scale of what their partners have. But what we're also seeing, because my company, we're technology manufacturing, but we're also focused on that we do manufacturing of data protection and cybersecurity devices. And a big risk that's happening is they're also pushing those. The thought is they would be pushing the risk out to the third parties, but it's actually increasing their risk as a customer. So we're seeing a lot of opportunity as a cybersecurity company that those customers that are starting to think about how do I actually still leverage the third parties, but have more control at least of what our business critical assets are. And I think those are the people that are the companies that are going to be able to differentiate, to be able to pivot quickly, because I think the pervasiveness of third party taking on more work and us being globally integrated, the key is going to be how do you make sure you still keep control of the core business assets that drive your business.
When you have a supply chain like that, you don't have control over the ownership, the integrity of the actual systems you're building. Is that the issue?
It can be.
Hmm.
That's the thing. It can be unless you're intentional about it. And I think that's one of the things, even in the work that I do, not just as an executive, but in board service,
Hmm.
because I serve on a board that's a board based out of Japan. As you're looking at, okay, how do we save costs? How do we actually push more out, being more intentional? But what are we going to do if a disaster does happen? My view is if you haven't been hacked, you just don't know you've been hacked.
Right.
The
Right.
cybersecurity risk is just going to increase more and more. So what are you doing up front when you form those agreements with the third party, or when you choose that third party in terms of how they're going to be handling your data, how quickly you're going to get that, be able to keep control of that data? I think that's the key, right?
When you're thinking about supply chain, I have to imagine that tariffs and the potential complexity of a global trade
Mhm.
war has got to be top of mind too. How are you thinking about that in this planning process?
I actually think the planning doesn't change because
Hmm.
really, I think a core fundamental of global supply chain is you always have to have second and third sources. You always have to have options because whether it's tariffs, whether it's pandemic, there's
Right.
always something that's going to go wrong in supply chain. Whether it's a boat that's stuck in the Panama Canal, you see all those things that happen. Whether it's a flood and that happens in Taiwan that floods out factories. So I think us staying with the basics of always having backup plans, having multiple sources of where your supply is coming from, making sure you're diversified in multiple locations. I think that's the key. I don't think tariffs necessarily are the only reason to do that, but you're right. With that coming, it just makes them even more and more important.
Are there any other risks that are top of mind for you?
I think another risk that I know a lot of technology manufacturing people are focused on is talent. It's actually the human capital piece. And it's really about the human capital and making sure the skills we're getting access to the skill sets that we're going to need, not today, but 20 years out. And how do you start planning for that? Because the technology is moving much faster than I think. Even when we think about planning for how fast the technology moves, it's always going to move even faster. And how do you make sure you're starting to bring in those skill sets, whether you're training people that you have or actually sourcing it? And I would say the talent for technology manufacturing, it's been a challenge, honestly. It's been a challenge for the people on my teams in terms of not just within the US, but globally.
So that it's
Yeah.
talent development, succession
Mhm.
planning, issues like that. Okay,
Exactly.
interesting.
Yeah. And actually, the reality is technology manufacturing is one of those industries where you actually have to be on site. And I'll say another challenge we're having is also finding the talent that's also open to coming on site and the balancing of the skill sets that we need, as well as the workforce wanting to have the being able to be competitive and offer the remote options as well. And some of those things we're thinking about personally is, okay, do we need to move our locations to places where people actually want to live, right? Because there is a migration that's starting to happen from California, from other places in the US to more central US and things like that. So I think the companies that are thinking about that is going to be important because talent is key.
Absolutely. And one of the
Hmm.
themes I hear in what you're discussing just from the outset is you really have to be prepared for the unexpected. That seems very clear in our
Yeah.
conversations. And I know that you have been with Overland-Tandberg for more than 13 years now. You've experienced industry disruption. Obviously, the pandemic was challenging for you all and for
Mhm.
really for all of us. 50% of your revenue disappeared in just one quarter, which would be a shock to any organization. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened and what did you do about that problem?
Yes. The pandemic happened. And the driver of that really was because we do cybersecurity solutions that go into the data center. And so we're part of IT budgets. And not surprisingly, during the pandemic, most of our customers' IT budgets had to shift
Mm-hmm.
to remote work. We all had to shift everybody who were people working into the office and making the investments that needed to happen so they could be effective working at home. And so what happened was a lot of the projects that we had planned in people's budgets got pushed out a year. And so that really resulted in our revenue dropping by 50%. Now, one of the positive parts of that is I'm really proud of the culture and the customer focus that we had as a company. And even though we were in that crisis, we did not stop engaging with our customers to understand what their challenges were, to understand if there were still things we could do for them. And it actually opened a door of opportunity for us where just talking with a number of customers and seeing the challenges they were having getting access to medical devices, right? The PPE, right?
Mm-hmm.
To the
Mm-hmm.
personal protective equipment they were trying to get it for their employees. And we through brainstorming as a team, I can say it wasn't my idea. It was actually someone within my team's idea to actually partner with this services provider to actually distribute that type of equipment for a few of our customers. And the reason is because you mentioned earlier, we're in 100 countries. So we
Mm-hmm.
actually had the infrastructure to distribute for some of our customers that also had employees in those 100 countries. And so it allowed us to essentially replace that revenue within a quarter. And globally, it took us 6 weeks to ramp and do a complete pivot. The reason is we had the infrastructure, but I also think we had the focus on the customer. We stayed engaged and we have a culture of teamwork and collaboration that just allowed us it was all hands on deck. Before that, I had never ever had to work with a freight forwarder or a logistic provider to ship out product, but I did. It was all hands on deck to get it done for the customer.
I love this story because what a great win in that obviously you
Mhm.
had revenue targets to meet and revenue to replace, but you really took advantage of that existing supply chain, those in-country resources that you had. We talk about this all the time in business, right? We're trying to solve real problems for customers, and when the problem changes, even if it's outside your scope, I think that it's really impressive that your company took advantage of that and made solve that problem because it was a real problem for your customers. So I think
Yeah.
that's impressive.
It's oftentimes when you're pushed up against the wall to say, as a company, if we lost 50% of our revenue, so now we're concerned about, okay,
Right.
how do we keep the business viable? Not only viable for our investors and stakeholders, but we want to keep our people employed.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I think sometimes that pushes innovation and creativity when you're in that crisis.
Absolutely. And I also think there are organizations where they would double down on what they already know and do well and try harder at the thing. And what's
Mhm.
interesting is this really was a real pivot. It was what can we do, meaning what is the need from the customer side of it. And I suspect that's why
Yeah.
it's helpful. Was there any internal resistance, or does Overland-Tandberg have the kind of culture where people were open to kind of meeting that moment?
I want to say internal resistance. It was more internal fear, right? Just like,
Mm,
how are we going to do this? How are we going to, but I think as a leadership team, we all were aligned
right.
that this was what we were going to do for the customer, right? And so I think because as a leadership team globally, we were aligned, it gave the confidence and the support, right? Because I think also there was a fear because we hadn't been in the space before. So it was very likely we were going to make mistakes, and we definitely did make mistakes. And so I believe that the leadership team, we gave the organization the ability and the comfort to know, hey, you're going to make mistakes. We're here to support you, but we're going to get this done for the customer, right?
Was there anything else that was helpful, which might be a takeaway if you were going to advise other leaders that were doing this?
What I would say is it is so important to, we were talking about earlier, innovation. It is so important to set goals for your team, but then let them go figure it out. Because I believe some of the things we did, I wouldn't have been able to think them up myself, right? Some of the ways we were able to deliver the product, some of the ways we were able to ramp up so quickly, it was really because of the innovation of the team and the fact that we were basically doing daily calls, daily brainstorms, literally attacking because there was a new problem every day, right? Because
Right.
I think all of us were learning during the pandemic, right? There was a new problem every day to solve. And yeah, so that's what I would say from a leadership perspective is it's okay not to have all the answers as the leader.
I'm also hearing you say that you gave your team a lot of space, and it sounds like you had trust in your teams and they really
Mm,
delivered too. So I think that's very
yeah.
inspiring. Let's get into M&A. Overland-Tandberg has grown through acquisitions, and I know this has become a real area of expertise for you. You've personally been involved in 9 deals. There might even be a
Mhm.
10th one, if I
That's
recall
true.
correctly. So maybe you're into double
Yeah.
digits now.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience has been like?
It's been an awesome experience because the thing about M&A is it's not only about the transaction itself and the numbers. It is so about the people too.
Right.
Even though I am naturally an introvert, I'm very curious and interested in people in terms of what drives them. And so I would say throughout all of these deals, the ones that have been successful from what I've seen, and to me, success means was what you wanted to achieve in the deal achieved 3 years later, right?
Mm,
And the ones that succeed are the ones where I've seen the focus of the culture and the customer is upfront. And the times where it didn't, we didn't achieve those goals, it was when we didn't follow those tenets up front to ensure that we're thinking about the culture and the customer in the merger, in the acquisition. Because ultimately, like I was talking about how talent is so important, it really is. People is really what's going to drive the success of whatever the deal is. It's not really about only the numbers and the business case for the transaction.
I think that is super helpful. Was there a transaction that was particularly meaningful to you?
I would say the one of them was when we did a merger where the business at the time was US, pretty US centric. I would say 80% of our revenues were in the United States. And we had the opportunity to merge with a company that was headquartered in Europe. And I would say 80% of their business was in Europe. When you look at the synergies perspective of bringing those two together, you're pretty much able to your customer base as well as diversify it right across the globe. The meaningful part of it was the effort that we did up front of integrating the leadership teams,
Hmm.
which I believe really helped us drive the culture globally, integrating the team. So, for example, what in the due diligence up front, we started really talking about the org charts up front, even before the deal was done, really talking about how are we going to make sure the culture pieces of the Europe company and the culture pieces of the US company that we wanted to maintain would be achieved. And we determined the key to do that was to ensure that we had leaders from both sides but taking on global roles, right? So let's say you have a leader in Europe, they were focused on Europe originally, but now they take on a function like maybe it's an operations function or finance function, but now they have a global role. And the same thing on the US side. And I think that's what made it meaningful was those relationships was formed up front and we were able to drive that culturally. And I'll say that merger is really the company that I'm running now. And that merger happened in 2016, 2015 or 2016.
Oh, wow. So almost 10 years. Where did that come from? Was that really a discussion between the two CEOs, or had one of the companies seen success with that strategy previously? Where did the idea come from?
Yeah, I would say it actually came from our CEO at the time where you, I've done 9 deals. He's probably done 50. And I think similar to my experience, like I was saying, the success factors that I've seen are culture. He had the same experience, right? And so I
Yeah.
think he was pretty upfront in the beginning of the deal, in the beginning of the due diligence with that leadership team, as well as with the investors that were part of it. That was going to be really critical because it was really, like I was talking about, it was a merger of equals. And he really drove that. And I learned a lot from it. And it's really what I've been using as my template as well for transactions.
And it sounds like he is or was low ego enough to really create space for everyone. In your tenure, you have managed a challenging asset deal too that aimed to double revenue, but it actually ended up, unfortunately, in a revenue loss. Can you tell us about that? What happened?
Yeah, that was a deal that I was a part of about 11, 12 years ago. And it was actually a deal that it wasn't something where we said, hey, this is our strategy. We're looking for an opportunity and to look like this. It was more opportunistic, but on paper, it was perfect because it was a complementary technology. So we had the infrastructure to support it. We had a sales team that already knew how to sell it. The customer base they had was actually in a space where we were not. So we really saw it as accretive value. On paper. It looked great, but because it was opportunistic, the deal timeline we had was very short. We're looking for people that are willing to do something within 6 weeks, which from a
Wow.
transaction perspective
Yeah.
is really fast.
Quick.
And because of that, in hindsight, I look back, we didn't follow those tenets that we know work, which is focusing upfront on the customer and the culture in the due diligence to determine if it's really going to be a fit for success in the future. We didn't do that. We closed the deal. And after closing that was when we started to see where there was a disconnect in really what the customer needs were, just what we thought, assumed, because we didn't fully do that due diligence that we said that customer looks like our customer. So we're pretty sure we'll be able to support them the way they need to be supported. And it turned out it was a very different customer need that really required different resources than we had. And so then it was really about, okay, now we're going to invest more to keep this customer, or are we going to, how are we going to be able, what are we going to be able to do to save, to basically save it? And unfortunately, we weren't able to do that because then making additional investment really was counter to the business model that we had set in place to do the deal in the first place. But it was a lesson learned. Just even now, right, I've recommended turning away from deals because I know we wouldn't have the time to be able to do that due diligence to make sure it's the right thing for the company.
Does that mean that you think a short window is generally not possible for a successful deal, or just that the criteria really need to match what you know to be your own strategic priorities?
I'll never say that a timeline's too short, but like you said, when it's that short, there needs to be a lot of information up front. And typically those types of deals, you don't necessarily have the time to gather it. So if it's not available, you have to understand the risk that you're taking in addition to just the business risk because of those unknowns, right? Not only in my operating role, but also from a board perspective, that I think those are the types of questions that have to be asked. Hey, the timeline of this is short. How are you adjusting your M&A process to make sure you're doing the due diligence you need to do? Or what makes it still worth the risk to go after the deal in this short timeline?
As COO, and even in your prior career, you have really prioritized integration. That's also the area where so many deals seem to go wrong in M&A. How do you approach integration, and how do you think about it in terms of long-term value creation for the company?
I try not to come in with assumptions up front. And I think I was mentioning earlier around how important it is to make sure that you're listening and taking inputs from the entire team to be able to make those. The key is the collaboration, but I think also we were talking earlier about being very clear on what your goals are. So I think with integration is taking the time up front to say, okay, in a year, this is our objective. In another year, here's our objective. And as you get to those milestones, if you're not meeting those, sometimes it takes courage, having the courage to stop and pull back and say, okay, what do we need to adjust? Because I think what you were alluding to earlier is oftentimes once that deal is done, and let's say the synergy work is starting and the integration works is starting, and everyone can see it's not achieving what the goals were. Oftentimes, culturally, it can be a challenge to stop,
Right.
right? Because the commitment's been made, because
Sunk cost. Yeah.
exactly, you've already said, hey, these are the things we're going to do. And even when you're public, you've maybe made commitments that these are the things you're going to do. But I think it is important to be very clear on what your goals are, but also have a tracking mechanism. So you're checking in, and that your leadership team is giving the ability to pivot, allows you to make a pivot if you need to midstream because you can still achieve those goals, because any deal, no matter how long you do due diligence, there's always things you don't know until you're until the transaction is complete. And so giving yourself the grace to adjust and pivot is so important.
In your organization, do the deal originators also stay really involved in integration, or is it that you have a separate integration function and there's a really clear handoff?
That is a great question, because I would have to say it depends, right? It depends, because it depends on the type of deal it is and how much integration work is needed. What I found is, what as a company, we try to keep the people that are involved in the deal also have some stake in the integration, whether it's incentives, objectives, because it also helps them have a understanding of that when they're doing a deal.
They have
Right?
skin in the game.
Exactly.
Because you're a serial acquirer. Is it that type of function where it's just a really well-oiled machine, or how has that
Yeah.
evolved?
So we do have a program management office, and that is their essential function. That's one of their functions. So they have two functions. One of their functions is our PMO runs all of our new product introductions. So they run that process, and then they also run all of the integration.
So, one of the things I thought was so interesting when we were first connected is that your experience leading M&A, I think, is a huge value add to your board service. And you alluded to the fact that you serve on a board of a Japanese company. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that transactional experience has been brought to bear in board service, and how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, I think it's really valuable, especially the global piece of it, because I think the pandemic, even though we knew it before, it reminded us just how globally integrated we all are.
Right.
Even if your
Right.
business is US based, even if your business is based in Japan, you're all globally integrated. There's all
Right.
these cogs, and one cog is off, right? I think the value I'm able to bring is that context of, are we really thinking about what's happening globally? Are we thinking about this problem too much in a silo, or really just challenging the management team? How are you thinking about this from a global perspective? Are you thinking about the different risks that we have from a geopolitical perspective? And like you were saying, the things with tariffs that are coming up. So I think it helps, because at least I'm typically one of the few people that have that global context in those discussions. And so I think it brings a lot of value just to make sure that we're stepping back to think about what are those risks and what do we need to do to mitigate them.
I know you're also really passionate about asking the right questions. And certainly in recent years, it feels like board oversight has been in the news far more often for not
And
great reasons. Obviously, you're a smart, curious person. I'm sure that's part of the answer. But
Mhm.
how do you think about that? And are there insights that you think boards in general could adopt?
I have a lot of great mentors that have been doing board service for a very long time. And so I've learned a lot from them that, number one, it is so important just to remain a student all the time. And so I think oftentimes we're asked to join boards because of certain experience that we have, but things are changing so much and
Mhm.
fast it is so important to stay up to date on what's happening so that you can actually ask those questions. And I think another piece too, it may sound really basic, but it's just important to be prepared. Like just be prepared for the discussion, because usually in any board meeting, whether it's a company board, whether it's a nonprofit board, whatever the board, usually that oversight, the management team is giving you the information ahead of time to prepare. And so I found that if I just really take the time to prepare, do research so that I have questions prepared, oftentimes it also helps us just use the time more efficiently in the board meeting and get to those core questions and discussions that we need to have.
Yeah. Yeah. And one would hope that's something that's important to all boards.
It is based on the mentors that I work with, and I'm involved in a couple of organizations that are there to help directors learn more. I do see a shift in it because everything in business is just changing so fast, right?
Yep.
It's as a board, you really have to do the work to learn more, educate yourselves more, to be effective, to really just be effective for the company, for the stakeholders that you're representing, and for the management team that you're supporting.
I think this is such an important point because I do think you're right. The rate of change has accelerated. I think we all feel it. There's a lot of hard data to support that too. How do you think about that in the context of the business case for having diverse perspectives on boards? Because I know this is important to you too. I really share that. I think that's one of the things you and I connected on when we first met.
Yeah.
But how do you think about that? Because I think it is related back to the types of questions that different board members will ask based on their own experiences, right? So tell me how you think about that.
I think about it back to what I was talking about earlier around culture and customer, because you think about like the population, let's just look at the population in the US. It's 50% women, 50% of the workforce is women, right? 50% of the customers are women. And same thing with people of color, right? I think what the census says I think it's 2040. It's around 2040 that from adults, the majority of adults will be people of color, that it will be minority white after 2040. And so to me, as a board, your leadership team and your board should reflect your customer base, should reflect your workforce, should reflect your stakeholders. And so I think that's why it's so important to have that diversity of experience and thought and culture, because that's what our customers look like. That's what your investors look like. That's really the makeup of the U.S. and the world.
We're recording this the end of November in 2024, and that rate of change and the fact that it is a more diverse and integrated world is also causing a lot of resistance and negative reaction, right? That's certainly been forefront here in the United States this past year. How do you think about that as a board member with global experience?
I think we talked about fear with change, right? It's change. So I believe it's human nature to not want to change. But again, as a leader in a company, as a board member, change is going to happen. And so to me, the sooner we get comfortable with that, the better we're going to be as an economy, as a company. And to me, that's really where the focus has to be, is how do we push past that fear of change? Because the reality is the change is happening. We can't stop it.
And it's funny because I agree with you, and yet it really does seem like it just drives so much reactivity.
Like I said, I believe that's a fear. It's a fear.
No, I think you're right.
Of that unknown, right? I firmly believe those companies, those leaders that can embrace that and push past that fear and embrace the change, that's who's going to win. Because, like I said, the world is moving, right? And it's either you're on that train or you're not.
What's the hardest thing that you've had to do professionally, and what did you learn from it?
This answer, it's part professional and part personal. When I think about my career, like the hardest thing I had to do was make a decision to stop my career path, because I was working in the semiconductor industry because a relative of mine got really ill. And I prioritized taking that time off to help with his care, as opposed to I didn't want someone else taking care of him, basically. We could have outsourced it. But I'm thankful for making that decision. It was really scary, but it actually pushed me into starting a consulting business, working part-time, where I really learned I have so much more respect for entrepreneurs and the grit and the focus that you have to have. I did it for personal reasons because it gave me flexibility, but I think it actually made me a much better leader because I was having to run the whole business myself. I had come from larger companies being one key piece of a large company. And so I was really managing my own company on my own. And I learned so much. I learned flexibility. We said pivot a lot, how to pivot quickly. And it actually opened the door for me to shift into cybersecurity because one of the clients that I took on during that time when I was doing the consulting was the company I'm with now. Because I was working with our current CEO to help them develop product development processes because they were going through a big transition at the time. So I would say that was difficult because it was scary to make such a change, but I probably grew the most from it. And my relative is fully recovered and he's fine. So
I
that's
love
also
that.
the great news.
Yeah, it's a happy story and an
It is.
incredible development for you too. What is something everyone takes for granted which you think is inaccurate?
I'll speak about tech since I've worked in the technology industry my whole career. And this is internally. I think internally, we take for granted as technical companies that we actually know the answer. Meaning we have the tech, we know what the customer needs. And this may seem surprising, but I've been in many technology meetings where, you go through this great tech and finally someone asks the question, so what's the customer feedback on this? Or has there been a study on how the market would take this on? No, actually, we just think it's really great.
We just think it's cool. Yeah, totally.
And
Totally.
then, so I would say, I think that's something that happens, and I don't know if people realize that happens a lot more than I think people realize, where the focus is so on the tech as opposed to what we were talking about before, the problem that you're solving and the customer that you're serving.
I could not agree more. I have seen this too, and I'm just nodding aggressively over here. Tina, this has been such a great conversation. What do you think that high performance organizations do differently from average performers?
I think it's culture. I think the companies that are aggressively focused on culture, and I'll give you an example because my husband actually, he runs an advertising agency and he does a lot of work with brand architecture.
Sure.
And one of the exercises that he does, he's done it with my leadership team, is he says, okay, everyone take a Post-it note and everyone write down what you believe is the key value proposition of the company. And everyone writes it down. He said, it doesn't matter if it's a Fortune 10 company. It doesn't matter if it's a 5-person company. 90% of the time, all the answers are different.
I bet.
The companies that are just fanatically focused on having a consistent brand and culture that they, it's not just at the top, but it doesn't matter who you talk to in the organization, understand it. Because if that's the case, then the customer is going to understand it, which means it's going to be just very clear what your market and brand differentiation is. And I think that's what drives high performance organizations versus those that don't.
What a great answer and such a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tina. We really enjoyed having you.
No, thank you. And have a good Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You too. Lots of pumpkin pie, I hope.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how I judge Thanksgiving.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for listening to Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show, give us a rating, or leave us a review. It helps other listeners find us, and we really appreciate your support. You can also catch full videos and highlights on our YouTube channel.